Cat.
It's gonna gate crash the entire meeting, I think.
Right.
So have you just let the instructors in, or do we only have instructors here today?
No, we have everybody right now.
Oh.
Including, yeah.
Okay.
I see another cat.
Oh God.
Good timing.
Oh, I was actually talking about Kate Jung, who seems to have a cat
Oh.
profile photo.
Okay. Hi everybody. My name is Alexis, and I'm at the University of Waikato in New Zealand. This is Ruby. She will gate crash for the entire meeting, I think. And welcome to the first lesson of R. There might be a couple of teething things that we'll get through today, but we're really excited to be starting this new platform. As you'll notice, as everyone entered from the waiting room, you're all muted. Feel free to unmute yourself if you want to ask a question while we're going through things. Also, I'm not sure if people are familiar with Zoom, but when you go down to participants, I think, it says manage participants on mine, but there should be a little button down the bottom where you can raise your hand. Or can anyone see that? Can anyone raise their hands? Yeah, I'm seeing a few hands come up. Perfect. Okay. So when that happens, yeah, you can, I'll see that, and so I'll be able to stop and ask you a question along the way. The other function is the chat button down the bottom, so you can use that to ask questions. Feel free to ask any questions that you have or anything that you'd like clarified a little bit more. The other thing is that it's being recorded so that we can look through this later as well. So yeah, just so you're aware of that as well. I'll pass over to Sarah.
All right, hi everyone. My name is Sarah Hu. I'm a postdoc fellow at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and I'm gonna be running our first R lesson, which I'm really excited about. We have a lot of instructors here. You've probably seen some of our names on the Slack channel so far, and I'll go over all those materials. Let's see. Because this is our first lesson, I'm gonna share my screen, which I know how to do. And can everyone see that? Can everyone see my Rstudio screen? Okay, great. Okay. So this is our Slack channel, which this is gonna be where most of the communication is gonna go. If you have a question for us, feel free to add it here. Slack is also searchable, so you can search for previous questions if you feel like someone might have already asked this question. We're all on there. I think it's going well so far, where we have some pinned things which you can access right here, and it should come up right here. So I have all the information for lesson 1, and Jacob has posted hours for the office hour that'll be on Friday that we'll continue having each week. So the idea is that we'll have kind of 2 sessions each week. I think that I outlined that in one of the other pinned tweets as well. So the first pinned tweet, if you scroll all the way down, has kind of all of the links that we'll need for all these lessons. First, besides the Slack channel, we'll be relying on this GitHub page. This is from the BVCN GitHub. You've probably all been on here now. We'll continue populating this each week with more lesson information. You can look at the agenda. I added some additional information about what Rstudio Cloud is. And we'll continue posting a live video each week that'll be like 10 to 15 minutes that will probably kind of happen you can view it in the first half of the week when hopefully we'll have it up. But we'll kind of take, like, you notice the lessons today started at like 4:10. So it'd be a great time to review that video for 10 minutes right before we start. So we might continue doing that each week. Another resource that you can link to from here, or actually from the homepage for BVCN, is the wiki. And so this is the R topic wiki that we'll continue populating. And this is meant to be kind of a longer term archive of all the things that we go over. So we'll continue compiling an extended list of resources here. And this is based a list of lessons where we have 1 right now, just the introduction, and 2 is still in development right now, but we'll continue adding like a basic outline of all the lessons here. And you'll see all the other topics are continuing to populate their wikis. So let's get started with the lesson. This is what I see when I look at the BVCN network, or the Workspace in Rstudio Cloud. And all of you should have copied over lesson 1 to your own workspace. And I'm going to talk, I know I talked about it a little bit during the video, but I'm going to open up my lesson 1 workspace right now and orient you a little bit more on this page. But if you have any questions, now's a really good time to chime in, raise your hand, look at the chat, type in a question in the chat function, and Alexis will help kind of field some of those questions. So if you weren't able to get to this point and see this workspace open right now, then chime in now and we'll try to troubleshoot that. So Rstudio Cloud, right, it kind of circumvents that need to have everyone install whatever version of R. Some of you might already have R installed on your computer, and we can talk about options to that. Office hours later this week is a great time to talk about how everyone else runs R. I run R actually 3 or 4 different ways on my computer, depending on what project I'm working on. But Rstudio Cloud, for this purpose, is really great because we're all using the exact same version of R. We can easily provide code for you and provide a whole working environment, and we don't have to worry about dependencies. Any major questions so far? I actually don't think I can see the chat. Come on. I don't think so. Okay.
Can I just ask, can everybody just raise a hand on that function to say that you actually have the lesson 1 plan live and that no one's behind? Thanks.
Cool. All right. So I talked about this in the video, but this is we're going to go through parts of this Rstudio area again, where this is the link to actually open the code. And every time we execute a command from up here, which on a Mac is Control Enter, on a PC it's Command Enter, I believe. It sends it to this console, okay? And so when you run R on the basic command line without Rstudio interface, it actually looks more like this. So each week when if there's a file that we want you to open in R or any other dependent objects or files, then they'll all appear in this file folder here. And that's what that is. And I'd recommend, it's an optional prerequisite, but for this class, if you go into some of the basic Unix or intro to Unix, which we provide links to on the BVCN websites, then you'll get more information on how these directories and how you can access different directories and folders on your own computer. So if you end up needing to run R on another machine or set it up a different way, that's kind of how you would orient yourself. And then as we play around with some of this, the commands and code that we have here, we'll see things start populating up in the environment. And as I type in commands, they'll start showing up on my history as well. Later on, when we go into plotting, then plots will also show up here, that's like the #1 reason why I use Rstudio, is that as I'm working, I can see visualizations as they come out. And another thing that I really like about Rstudio is that there's an easy way to do help functions, right? So we'll get to a function later on that's called names, but we can type this in here, hit Command Enter, and we get a help menu that pops up right here. All right, so we'll be using that later. So this is all code from Liz Sutter. She provided this. I went through the first 20 or so lines in the video, so I'm not going to skip that right now. But I am going to assign this variable X and then see what happens in my global environment here. X is showing up. And everyone's able to execute these commands, right, so far? Okay, great. So I'm going to go through some of these commands and explore them with you. Both Alexis and I were just talking about this. We're both pretty much self-taught in R. I've taken a variety of different tutorials online, usually written tutorials. And so me going through these, I'm gonna do my best to define absolutely everything I can and answer every single question, but I might end up showing you how I learn R, which is by Googling some things in that process if you have a question I can't answer.
Okay, we have 2 raised questions.
All right.
See if I can do this. Alla, did you have a question? No? Or Jacob?
I do, yes. Could you zoom in a little bit? If you just go to your, I think the view menu, you can zoom in. It makes it a little easier to see on my screen, at least the code is pretty small that you're sharing.
Is that better?
I would actually go to the view menu inside of the RStudio console. Maybe it's the wrong place.
Oh,
Somewhere other, maybe I can only do this on my own computer. You can often zoom in just within RStudio on the code to make the code really big.
Oh, really?
You know, if I figure it out, I'll tell you. You can keep going. Oh.
I don't know.
If I figure it out, I'll let you know. Sorry, I didn't realize it wasn't simple.
What did I do now? Okay. Let's see. I will just make this as big as I can right now. Is that still clear for everybody, pretty much? Okay.
That's better.
Okay. Let's just start going through some of these commands, and we'll see. We'll try to define some of the really basic variables and terminology that we need to know before going into more advanced R topics. Right, this was a variable that I assigned to X. So now anytime I use that variable X, I can, it's going to be 42, which is what we had up here. So I'm highlighting all of this and then executing that command. But now down here, I'm actually changing X to be a list. This list includes 1, 7, and 9. And lists can include different types of data, which we'll get to in a little bit. Right now, these are all numerics. And then now when I type X rather than 42, it lists all those values. And then another way we can start to actually break down that list is by putting this value 2 in these brackets, and then we're just going to report 7, right? So then when we do, we can select 9 from this list by bracketing 3, for instance. So two quick things when it comes to kind of busting through these commands that I wanted to point out is that we're working in RStudio, and so when I put a parentheses, RStudio actually puts both sides in, which is really great. I was even revising a manuscript this morning, and I wanted to put something in parentheses, and I left off the second one, and I often do that because I work in RStudio so much, and it completes it for me. So it's a great feature of RStudio. Another thing is you'll notice that this line right here, listen calling, is preceded by this this hashtag mark, this comment. I call them Commentinout variables, but this line of code is great to put in notes, right? So this is not going to be an active code at all. And so if I wanted to play, like for instance, when I'm writing more complex functions and I need to kind of pull out different variables, I'll have a line of code that I can comment in and out. I realized I just did a shortcut for that, which on a Mac is Command-Shift-C to comment in and out lines. So this makes it inactive, and this activates it again, right? So I annotate so much in my R code, and I recommend that you do the same. I like to think that as I code, I'm writing a letter to future Sarah so that when future Sarah looks at past Sarah's code, she does not get really frustrated with whatever I did previously. So I highly recommend you just over annotate everything. I guarantee you future you will be much happier. And that gets easier, I promise. So let's keep going, right? So I assign those things to X. That makes sense. I think a lot of us, especially if you're have more scientific training, X as the variable makes sense, but we can really assign anything a variable. So here I'm going to assign apples and oranges as a value of 5 and 6. And then here on line 29, we can actually add up apples and oranges, which equals 11, of course. And as I'm doing this, right, it's printing out at the bottom, it's printed out 11. But when I execute this, I've now again assigned apples plus oranges to a new variable, which is fruit. So that's again a quick reminder about this variable assignment symbol with the caret and the dash. So those are just, that was like a quick run through of variables and how you can overwrite them. And now we're going to talk a little bit about data types. And the best way I'm going to do this is just go through different data types and show you how I determine what a data type is as I'm coding in R. I think the most common way that I use some of the commands I'm going to show you next is troubleshooting errors, where I'll get an error that says you have the wrong type of class or what you're working with is not a numeric, and I'll kind of talk to you about what that means. So first we're assigning the variable oranges, or the variable oranges a grapefruit. So now when we type in oranges here, we get grapefruit on the other side. But what is oranges exactly? And this is where we use class. And so when you do a class and then in parentheses you put that object, it's going to deliver what data type it is. So in this case, oranges is a character, and that's because it was a set of, it's text within quotes of some kind. And we'll continue using characters a lot. I use them a lot. And then here's, again, we did this previously by assigning a variable with a numeric, and guess what the class is? It's a numeric. Okay, so kind of, this is R doing a little bit of the work for you, but then again, when we put it in quotes, it goes back to becoming a character. So you can think about how if you have sample 1 through 10, and that's just how you process them in the lab, and they ended up being samples 1 through 10 in the way that you process them, but you really want them to be 5 through 9, and then sample 4 and 3 and 10 in a different order, you might need to change them from a numeric to a character so you put them in the order that you want rather than in a numerical order, right? So that's kind of how you have to think about what data that you have in the, that's a data, yeah, that's why you need to think about the data class when you're working in R. Another one that I don't, yeah.
Can I just, does anybody have any questions? No?
Cool. Hopefully that means I'm being clear enough and not going too fast. Another one that I don't use as often, but will come up when we start doing more statistical approaches and data filtering maybe, is logical. And so the class is logical here, and we'll go through one more example in the context of vectors in a second. And everything I showed is, you know, you can see this link shows another resource for some of these really basic commands. And I think, you know, I've Googled things like how do you work with vectors in R, best practices with vectors in R, and you get a lot of little tutorials. So I definitely recommend, if you want to learn more about the nitty gritty of like what really is a vector or something, then definitely, you know, you can use that as a resource. One thing I'm going to quickly do right now, though, is actually talk about a Softwrap. So if you'll notice that this is of course, just a note, an annotation in our data, and I have to scroll all the way over to look at the whole line. But as we get code that's going to be a little more complex coming up, I want that to all appear like it would in a Word document where it will wrap around. And so when you, in Rstudio, you go up to, let's see, Tools, Global Options, and then here you have some options for changing the appearance, and I think you can even change the font of your R code or R environment. And here I'm going to, let's see, where did it go? Code, yeah, under Code tab, I'm actually going to hit Softwrap R source files and hit Apply. Okay, so now this line 46, wraps around in my source file instead of having to scroll all the way over. So that's one way that I like to work in R. And maybe as you work with other instructors, I'm sure they'll show you other ways that they set up their RStudio environment. Okay, so I'm gonna go over, right, everything we just talked about was like looking at a single variable, for instance. And of course, all of our data is very complex and there's lots of dimensions. And so we're gonna work up towards getting to two-dimensional data in a second. But first, we'll look at some vectors. So, right, we saw a difference previously with using quotes versus not quotes, but R does actually a pretty good job of finding numerics. So these are this is going to be a set of numeric vectors. So there's 3 items here, and then a character vector. And I'm going to continue using my class function to actually look at that. And I'm going to show one other great thing about using RStudio, right? After I've assigned my numeric vector and character vector, and I want to determine the class. When my cursor is inside these parentheses and I want to type out numeric vector next, I can actually hit tab, and it will show me my options, okay? This is probably not the best example, as there's a lot of things that start with numeric that are in R, but this shows you all the other options that you have to put into this, and that includes your variable numeric vector, right? And so later on, or if you start using R a lot, I have data tables that are like raw counts, right? And then I have filtered counts, and then I have filtered counts 1, I have filtered counts 1 and 2, filter counts 3, filter counts plus decontaminated, and my object, the names of these data tables get really long, right? And so this tab option is a really great feature of RStudio, because I don't have to type everything perfectly. And as you know, especially if you're interested in bioinformatics and have some experience with the command line, typos are nobody's friend. So that's one feature of RStudio that's great. So we know the class of numeric vectors, of course, numerics, and then I bet no one can guess what the class of the character vector is. You don't have to guess. It's a character. So now we're going to be assigning in names, and I want to look at what this actually pulled up the help menu of names previously to show you that, and I'll do it again. And when I use a lot of commands that require more complex help histories, I typically have this in my code where I can just quickly uncomment it out and execute it, pull up the help menu, and then I have an idea of what that command is. This is a pretty simple one where the only input is an R object, and you provide a value that you actually assign those names to. And that's what this line's doing here. So now I've assigned names to numeric vector, and then now when I execute that, I see A, B, and C, and then those numerics have now been assigned that name. And then before I look at X plus numeric vector, recall what X is, right? It's just a list of those values, 1, 7, and 9. And now we can actually add X to the numeric vectors, which is shown here, right? So now I've added that list of 1, 7, and 9 to my original numeric vector that I'm building on now. Another thing that I wanted to point out at this point, right, is I didn't assign X plus numeric vector to any new variable. So this is just showing up in my console down here. I would have to add a new name of some kind instead of equal to something to actually look at that. Another thing I wanted to do at this time was show you one of my other favorite commands in R that I think will be your new best friend, is view. So up here, our initial numeric vector that we created was called, the initial thing that we made was numeric vector. And if I put that in view, I actually get a whole new tab that pops up here. And this is a great way to kind of be, I'm very visual and I need to like look at everything. So this is a great way to actually just get a quick snapshot of what your data looks like. So it just makes it a new tab. It's kind of like exporting your data into Excel and then being able to open that up and like scroll through it. This is definitely something that maybe Ella will go through next week. But we'll use view again in a little bit to look at some of the other data types. How's everyone doing so far? Alexis, anything to add?
We did have a couple of questions, but I think you covered them. One was about combining data types.
Combining data types?
Yeah, maybe Ella, I think you're a little bit more over this.
Yeah, well, the question was, can you have a vector that has both numeric and character data? And the answer was that would be a slightly different, more general data type called a list, which is, I think, a little more complicated and kind of beyond the scope of this this class. But yes, it is possible. And I think that the last thing we said was, Jacob said was, you know, if you start with a numeric vector and then you add a character to it, like your vector was 1, 2, and then you add the word sheep, it's going to convert 1 and 2 into character vectors or character data types as well.
Yeah, I think one thing I would add on that that's like a real life example is, right, if you are working in Excel and you type in a new, and you want to like add everything up. So you have like, you type in the equal sign and then the sum and the parentheses or something, right? And then you select the column or the row that you want to sum up, or the set of cells. If you select those numbers and then you also select by accident your column header that's like final counts or something, then you'll get an error. And what you've selected is not just all numerics. And that's kind of where defining numerics versus non-numerics comes in when it in this context. So I don't know if I complicated it more, but that's kind of another way to think about it. So if I have a data table in R that has all of my sample names, labeling my sample sites, the year, the time collected, maybe something else about them, and then I have all of the values associated with those, whether it's like gene expression values or counts of some kind, right? I need to, if I want to do anything statistically to those values, like average all the temperatures or something, I need to make sure that I'm telling R to select just those values, just the numerics to do the averaging too. And we'll go over all of those things soon. This is kind of a basic rundown of some of the, and this, I think that's what I like about this lesson right now, is because I'm showing you those commands that really help you diagnose, if you've selected those numerics, how to diagnose, how to determine, how to collect those, if that makes sense.
And we'll get into that again in the next lesson.
Awesome. And then here's an example of the logical that I was using, I previously showed you, right? Where I'm showing X greater than numeric vector, and I get an answer of false, right? And so, right, X and then numeric vector is 1, 7, and 9. Was X greater than the numeric vector in each of those instances? And the answer is no, no, and no. And so that's how we get to this point. Okay, so now we can go into more of what a matrix is. More commonly, we'll be dealing with data frames and matrices and maybe tables. And those are the more like what you're used to in terms of a data table. Like I keep talking about Excel, right? When you look at a full Excel sheet, that's a data table of some kind, or a data frame. And so a matrix is very similar to that. And so by executing this command, actually, let's just pull up the help menu so we can kind of walk through it. Let's see. So in this help command, we're using matrix. the data that I'm putting in is going to be equal to values between 1 and 9, inclusive. This by row is equal to false here. And so the way I can diagnose what that means is in this matrix usage, by row is equal to false. This is the default usage, but I can scroll down to the arguments and read about what by row means. Okay, so if it's false, which is the default, which is encoded here, the matrix actually fills by columns. Otherwise, it fills by row. And here we have both of them. And then n row is likely how many rows do you want your matrix to be. Oops, I was wrong. Sorry. Wrong time. So then we actually want to define. I don't often make data frame or matrices from scratch like this. I'm usually importing some kind of data and working with it. So bear with me. But here I'm actually going to continue assigning some new variables, Q, R, and W, and include 2 numerics for each of them. And so when I combine all of them in this line, all of them are listed together, right? I'm just like adding Q, R, and W all together. And then I'm now going to put them into a matrix form where I've provided that data, right? All those values are presented here. This time we're actually filling by column, I believe, and the number of rows I want at the end is going to be 3. And then this is the matrix results. I'll continue. This is, you can see the whole thing printed here, but of course, I'll remind you about view as an option to actually pull it up in another item and another tab completely. Recall again in Excel when you go across and you have, let's see, is it letters at the top? Yeah, A, B, and C at the top, and then you have numbers on the side. Then this is like the column headers on the rows. So that's one thing that we're going to actually work on modifying next in this matrix. So this is what's printed here, and what I've shown you so far is just the base matrix. So now we're going to assign 2 new characters, region and category. We'll just confirm that those are characters, right? Because they're texts within quotes that I've assigned this to. And here I'm going to be assigning the row names of the matrix that I previously created to be equal to the characters present in class, and then the column names, I'm going to set them equal to region. Okay, so recall this is what my data set looked like previously. So by executing those 2 things, now when I pull up my matrix, I've actually include those those characters as category and region are now the column names and the row names. Okay, so you can imagine how this is a really important way to label your different sample numbers, your different sample names, for instance, and right, in a way, you're also able to like parse the numerics that are in your data table or in your matrix in that sense. Is everyone still with me so far? Good. Okay. Okay. And then one thing that I know we'll go into more of, like looking at an entire data table, doing something with the values and then merging them, or doing other applying other statistical approaches as we go along. I'm often using row sums. In this case, row sums literally just sums up everything in your matrix that you provided. And again, you can pull up the help menu if you want to learn what it's actually taking in and other parameters that you can put onto row sums to select that, again, those values out to actually sum them up. And this is presenting the total sums by row, right? It's adding up A, B, and C. And then if I said this row sums is actually just, again, sending it to the console so you see it printed out. We can assign it a variable though, and then we can work to combine it to our data set. Okay, so cbind, we'll actually pull up the help menu for that. In my head, I always have cbind means column bind. So this help menu actually pulls up both. It pulls up cbind or rbind. And because if we look at those matrices that we created individually, we have totals and then my data set. And you'll see one is listing, these values that are the sum of the rows. Some of the rows are labeled A, B, and C. And then in my data set, the matrices that by row, again, are labeled A, B, and C, because that's where it originated from. And so cbind knows and identifies that A, B, and C, and then lines it up and joins those. So this is a really powerful tool that we use a lot to actually work on merging data. And there's other ways, there's a lot of complex ways to actually merge data, but this is a good, very good quick example. And I think with that, I've covered all of this code, and I think I've gone through and added little things that I think about when I'm exploring code like this or diving into a new matrix or list, and I don't know what it is. But I'm happy to take any questions or review anything, expand on stuff, or we can pull up like a larger matrix or something. But yeah, so that's it for right now. Any questions or comments, especially from instructors? If you have anything to add, please let me know.
Oh, we have someone who's asking a question. Margaret, if you'd like to unmute.
Yes. Okay, so I have a question, just sort of interest. When we cbinded my totals, when we add totals, it automatically named the column totals.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering, is that just an automatic thing, or because like when we added Q, R, and W into the matrix, we made my data set, those names didn't like become names of the rows of the columns. So I'm just wondering, like, what is the difference there?
Yes, that is a good question. Does anyone want to answer? Instructors? No? Okay. That is a good question. I don't know if I have a perfect answer for you, but right, so if I just do the class of totals here, it's a list of numerics, but because I think it's because of the names function, right? So because totals originates from my data set where we have assigned those names, then let's see, then those names kind of stick with it as its lifetime. Of that variable. Does that make sense? Because these values are not, this is actually, I think, let me just double check.
I think Jacob has something to say.
Go ahead, Jacob.
Yeah, I mean, so you don't it cbind and very similar to that, the command data.frame will both assume that the name of your column is the name of whatever thing you put into it, but it doesn't have to, right? So if you want to name it something else, you can do that in the definition. So for instance, if you're to do, can I share my screen briefly?
Yeah.
Let's screw things up, Sarah.
Oh yeah, sure. I was just showing that rbind does not work because, right, if we're trying to combine it by rows, it's looking for those row names to be the same as that row names being A, B, and C. So if we tried to do it the wrong way of combining those, then it doesn't find that A, B, and C, so it gives you an error, which I just showed. And
I'm not sure it's the row names that are giving the error. I think it's just the wrong number.
It's looking for three different, filling three different rows, three total rows. But when I try to do rbind, right, then it's it's trying to put it into two spaces because it's trying to add the row to the bottom, whereas cbind is adding a column.
Okay. Jacob, are you able to share your screen? Is that what?
Let me give it a shot. Here we go. So if you wanted to find names for things, let's say you're making a matrix or a data frame, and you want to name stuff, you can do something like this, right? So if I have say two vectors, vec1 and vec2. Vec1 is c1, 2, and 3. Vec2 is c1. It's very similar. And then I want to stick those two together. I can specify the name by naming the first one. So I say cow equals vec1, horse equals vec2, and then you get a data frame that looks like this. So that's a matrix, right? If you want a data frame instead of a matrix, instead of cbind, you do data.frame, and you get basically the same kind of thing, except in data frame language.
But can you do the same thing, but without, but when you cbind
without the cow and the horse?
Yeah. Then
so then it's going to be named vec1, vec2, I think.
Yes.
Right, and we can do that with cbind as well. Yeah. So it defaults to naming them their actual names, but if you want to rename them, you can do that when you specify it, or you can rename them subsequently using row names like Sarah was saying. Right? So if I let's say like I save this, right? We'll call this we'll call that matrix 1. So matrix 1 looks like this, and now I want to rename the column names. I would do like call names mtx1. C cow horse, and then I rerun. Now I've changed the names again.
And we're gonna go over that again next week or next lesson.
Yeah. And I want to add one more thing to answer that question. When we did it in this code, we were asking because it was Q, R, and W, and when we combined it into a data set, those columns were not called Q, R, and W. Another reason that happened is that we were actually putting that was the data that we were putting into a matrix, and so it output a matrix. Whereas if you go back and you do cbind of Q, R, and W, then those columns are actually called Q, R, and W. So that's the difference between using matrix and cbind for this example.
And the same thing applies to rbind, right? So if we rbind vec1
Yes.
and vec2, the row names are vec1 and vec2. If we define them as cow and horse, and the row names are cow and horse.
Yeah.
Just like we did with cbind.
Does anybody else have any questions, or they want to cover something else in a bit more detail? Did people find this helpful? Yeah.
Great. Yeah, I guess if you have any questions, now is a great time to go over it. I think these lessons will generally go about an hour, which is where we're at right now. Friday we have office hours. So when you, I was going to say go home, but I think we're all probably home. When you're done with this and you have, or you start dreaming about R or something and you have another question, please add it to the Slack page, and the Friday office hours are a great time to check in and go over some of those, review this material. We can keep talking about cbind versus rbind and matrices or something.
And also at the office hours, we'll also just, if you're having trouble just getting Rstudio working for you, you want to get it installed on your computer, you're having trouble with that, you're trying to get Rstudio Cloud to work, and you're having little fiddly problems with that, we'll address any of those sorts of things. My plan is to leave that open for an hour. I'll be there, so even if there aren't people, I'll leave my window open. You're welcome to drop by for even just a few minutes. We can talk about whatever.
All right. Well, awesome, everybody. Thank you so much for attending our very first live session for learning R with the BVCN time. I hope everyone is staying safe and healthy, and these are always recorded. So I hope that if you're not able to tune in at any point, all this information is still available to you at whatever pace or whatever time you can access it.
All right.
All right.
Bye,
Thanks,
everybody.
everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Mm.